Polen hat heute Nacht zum ersten Mal auf unserem eigenen Territorium auch mit der regulären Soldaten geschossen. Seit 5:45 wird jetzt zurückgeschossen.
We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender.
The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. We will gain the inevitable triumph, so help us God.
Wollt ihr den totalen Krieg? Wollt ihr, wenn nötig, totale und radikale, als wir ihn uns heute überhaupt erst vorstellen können?
The Nazis entered this war under the rather childish delusion that they were going to bomb everybody else and nobody was going to bomb them.
Dresden, June 1943. Karin Klipken and Henry Ruppe exchanged wedding vows, meticulously documented on 35mm color film. It was a piece of idyll, almost 4 years after Adolf Hitler had plunged the world into war. The effects of the war were still barely felt in the city, which was not within range of Allied bomber raids, a situation that would not last forever. Ever since the British Air Ministry had issued the Area Bombing Directive in February of 1942, the number of air raids on German cities had increased significantly. The suffering of civilians in particular was growing.
It was the British who, more than any other air power, developed a system for destroying a city with an airstrike. And the British developed a method which they refined in 1943. The proportion of incendiary bombs, for example, was much higher than in the German attacks, and so was the tactic of using air mines. How that was coordinated and how they used radio control methods, master bombers that guided the others. That was a completely new procedure. It was now no longer if we kill civilians, we kill civilians. But the civilians became the main target.
One area of focus for the attacks was the Ruhr region with its heavy industry. The images of destruction were the same from city to city. Among other cities in the rural area, Dortmund also became a target. On the night of May 24th alone, 2,200 tons of incendiary and demolition bombs fell on the city. The Nazi leadership responded with a large-scale propaganda event.
Nun wird Dr. Goebbels in Dortmund zu der schwer geprüften Bevölkerung sprechen und die Grüße des ganzen deutschen Volkes überbringen, das den harten Kampf seiner Brüder in den luftbedrohten Gebieten Sein oder Nichtsein mit tiefer innerer Anteilnahme verfolgt.
The venue for the production, the Westfalenhalle, filled with over 15,000 spectators. Empty slogans of perseverance for the population of the Ruhr region, which had been shaken by the air war.
Dr. Goebbels sagte in seiner Rede unter anderem: Ich weiß, dass ihr hier einem schweren Terror ausgesetzt seid. Die Leiden, die euch durch den feindlichen Luftkrieg aufgezwungen werden, sind quälend und peinigend. Über den Belastungen des Tages dürfen wir nicht den Überblick über die Gesamtproblematik dieses Krieges verlieren. In keinem Augenblick dieses gigantischen Kampfes dürfen wir vergessen, dass es um Sein oder Nichtsein unseres Volkes und damit jedes einzelnen Deutschen geht. Wenn man sein eigenes Volk aus tiefster Seele lieben will, dann muss man seine Feinde auch aus tiefster Seele hassen können.
Ich bin der Überzeugung, dass in diesem Kriege wieder in allen Kriegen der siegen wird, der die stärksten Nerven, die meisten Faustbänder und die tapferste und die genialste Führung gewinnt. Das sind nicht unsere Feinde, das sind wir.
The Battle of the Ruhr, which was a Royal Air Force offensive, raged between March and July of 1943, during which almost all major German cities on the Rhine and Ruhr were bombed and thousands of people were killed. The regime tried to alleviate the plight of the victims.
One of the clever responses to the chaos caused by such carpet bombing was that certain consumer goods were kept in railroad cars until they were needed, some of which were also parked in tunnels. And then they would be available at relatively short notice.
Dann relativ kurzfristig verfügbar sind.
Die Frauenschaft verteilt Butterbrote für die Bombengeschädigten. Eier, Zigaretten, Obst, an alles ist gedacht. Die Hilfsorganisationen leisten mustergültige Arbeit.
If you were cynical, you'd say that Nazi propaganda and Goebbels used the bombings as an opportunity to expand the people's sense of community, the Nazi Volksgemeinschaft, because they understood great need, great suffering. We have to help. And who helped? The Nazi state.
In the face of massive destruction and high casualty figures, pessimism and resentment spread. However, open criticism of the situation was not tolerated under the Nazi dictatorship.
In the language of the National Socialists, there was a separation between morale and attitude, and the morale could easily crumble at one point or another. The regime also acknowledged that, or that there was mourning over losses or worries and hardships after bombing raids. But at the same time, the decisive element was the attitude in the language of Nazi propaganda, and the attitude from the regime's point of view seemed to be quite stable for a long time.
In midsummer 1943, Hamburg became the focus of Allied bombers. Before the outbreak of the Second World War, around 1.7 million people lived in the Hanseatic city. Warships were also built there, which provided work for tens of thousands of people. That is why, since 1940, the Hanseatic city had repeatedly been the target of air raids. In late July, the Allies launched Operation Gomorrah, named after the mythical city that, according to the Bible, was buried under a rain of fire and brimstone.
Operation Gomorrah was a terrifying, horrific special event in the air war. The British managed to knock out the German defense by building German radars with strips of aluminium foil, thus eliminating the German night fighter force. Therefore, these bombers could fly over the city relatively undisturbed. Hamburg was easy to get to. Hamburg was easy to find. They also had radar devices that could find and hit the city with relative precision.
Hamburg was attacked in several waves. The most devastating occurred on the night of July 27th. More than 100,000 explosive and incendiary bombs fell on the city, which quickly went up in flames. The hot midsummer weather that prevailed during those days bolstered the spread of the fires.
They attacked certain districts east of the Ulster. which were densely built up, and the British managed to set off a firestorm in this densely built-up area. And it was this firestorm that was destructive and deadly, because the attack was long over. The fire developed such power, a hurricane-like force, and it couldn't be extinguished. And so Hamburg burned for days, and even the Hamburg Fire Department and the Hamburg Civil Defense were not immune to the bombing, and that's why the civilian casualty figures were so immensely high.
The firestorm raged for over 5 hours in eastern Hamburg. Many streets in the city center also fell victim to the bombardment. By the end of Operation Gomorrah, a total of around 35,000 people had been killed. They suffocated in air raid shelters, burned to death in the streets, or were killed by falling debris. Over 100,000 residents were injured. In Berlin, the situation there was noted with concern.
The effect on people like Albert Speer or Goebbels was considerable. And they thought, what if this is going to happen to us more often now? A firestorm of this magnitude, so many dead. For God's sake, what will the German population do then? Can we then hold out against the war? But not every city was built like Hamburg. You also had to realize that it's relatively hard to kill 40,000 people in a city. It did work in Hamburg. Ultimately, the effect on morale, on the ability to wage war, remained limited.
At least half of Hamburg's apartments were destroyed. A contemporary witness wrote, "From the Wandsbek-Marienthal train station to the main train station, not one house is left. You are now completely homeless because it will take 100 years to rebuild." Those who didn't flee to the countryside had to come to terms with the danger of further attacks. The propaganda invoked the concept of Volksgemeinschaft, in which everyone pitches in. This newsreel from the fall of 1943 shows boys and girls helping to clear up bomb damage.
Viele unserer Jungen und Mädel haben sich in den Luftnotgebieten durch ihren tapferen Einsatz im Herzen des deutschen Volkes einen Ehrenplatz erworben. Eine Abordnung ausgezeichneter Jungen und Mädel Hamburgs in der Reichshauptstadt. Die Besichtigung des Reichssportfeldes führt Ritterkreuzträger Müller, der hier selbst einmal als Rekordläufer vielfache Siege errang. Der Hitlerjunge Werner Kahl, Träger des Kriegsverdienstkreuzes mit Schwertern. Der Hitlerjunge Kurt Pörschke, 12 Jahre alt, der jüngste Träger einer Kriegsauszeichnung, rettete 8 Kinder vor dem Flammentode. Die Mädelführerin Margarete Zettel barg aus einem brennenden Säuglingsheim alle Kinder, bis die Flammen auch ihr Kleid erfasst hatten. Inge Voss rettet in der Angriffsnacht aus völlig zerstörten Häusern 2 Menschen trotz einstürzender Decken. Die tapfersten der Jungen zeichnete der Führer mit dem Eisernen Kreuz 2. Klasse aus. In schwersten Stunden haben sie bewiesen, dass sie sich wie Soldaten zu verhalten wissen.
Since the beginning of their movement, the Nazis had attached special importance to children. After seizing power, they forced their influence on the younger generation.
When they attended kindergarten, they were looked after by teachers who had received National Socialist and ideological training. When they went to school, the only teachers were ones who had a positive attitude toward National Socialism. Their free time was organized by National Socialist organizations. Therefore, both the National Socialist insignia and the Hitler salute were part of their normal everyday life.
The youth organization Hitler Youth was founded as early as the mid-1920s. The National Socialists pursued clear goals.
For the National Socialists, this had a double meaning. First, the National Socialists saw themselves as a form of youth movement. So that means as an organization that mobilized the youth compared to the established parties, to the bureaucracies. And secondly, and this played a central role in the founding of the Hitler Youth, was the access to youth. The possibility of systematic ideologization, uniforming and militarization of those for whom this Third Reich, in its self-image at least, was now competing.
As in all areas of Nazi society, soldiering was glorified in the Hitler Youth. At the Reich Party congresses in Nuremberg, Hitler Youth delegations quickly became a permanent fixture. At the so-called Party Congress of Freedom in September of 1935, Adolf Hitler addressed the young people in attendance and outlined his ideals for the next generation.
deutsche Junge der Zukunft schlank und rank sein, flink wie Windhunde, zäh wie Leder und hart wie Kruppstahl.
Baldur von Schirach, pictured here to the right of Hitler, was supposed to be part of that. The German language and literature student was appointed the first Reich Youth leader by the dictator. In 1940, he was replaced by his previous deputy, Arthur Axmann.
In a way, Baldur von Schirach and Axmann were the prototypes of the youth political functionaries of the Third Reich. They were also well-educated, academically educated functionaries who entered the Nazi movement relatively early on and who shaped the Hitler Youth. And they did so in a very special way, namely, they turned the Hitler Youth, which was initially only a party organization, into a state youth organization. And this process was part of this ideologization of youth in the Third Reich.
Uniforms of the Bund Deutscher Mädel, or League of German Girls, and the Hitler Youth soon became part of everyday life in the cities of the Reich, as seen here during a march in Offenburg, Baden. Young people learned to march in step at an early age and were socialized in a military way.
The Hitler Youth was characterized first by the idea of the Führer, by being a leader, by youth leads youth as a guiding principle. Secondly, it was characterized by a concept of loyalty and morality. Loyalty to the Führer and a National Socialist morality linked to very specific conditions, to racism as an essential principle. And thirdly, it meant militarization.
For the regime, young people were first and foremost one thing: military recruits. A film shows the seemingly self-evident development from Hitler Youth to Wehrmacht soldier.
Hier schult die Hitlerjugend den Nachwuchs für die deutsche Marine.
In the youth organization, there were specializations for careers in the army. In the naval Hitler Youth, preparation for a career in the naval forces took place.
Einsteigen zum Kutterrennen. Mit letzter Kraft dem Ziele entgegen.
6 Reichssee sport schools were established in which the next generation was trained. An integral part of the education was also the use of military auxiliary activities.
Rund das Ulmer Münster sammelt Marine-Hitlerjugend mit Eifer Schallplatten für unsere U-Boot-Fahrer. Großadmiral Dönitz, der erfährt, dass die Ulmer Jungen mehr als 3000 Schallplatten für seine U-Boot-Männer gesammelt haben, ladet eine Abordnung in einen U-Boot-Stützpunkt am Atlantik ein. Stolz grüßt die Marine-Hitlerjugend im Atlantik ein erfolgreich heimkehrendes U-Boot und übergibt dann einen Teil der gesammelten 3000 Schallplatten an den Kommandanten.
Contrary to what these pictures suggest, the period of great successes for German submarines by 1943 was over. The cracking of the Enigma code and the increasing air supremacy of the Allies in the North Atlantic put a heavy strain on that military branch. Any encouragement, however small, was welcome.
Ein Maat legt die erste Kostprobe auf. In wenigen Minuten sind die Jungen und die Mannschaft ein Herz und eine Seele. Und nun die Überraschung für die Jungen. Großadmiral Dönitz begrüßt sie mit Reichsjugendführer Axmann auf dem Segelschulschiff Horst Wessel. Mit meinen U-Boot-Fahrern kann man dem Teufel den Bart abscheren, sagt der Großadmiral zu den Jungen. Auf seine Frage, was willst du einmal werden, kommt prompt die Antwort: U-Boot-Fahrer, Herr Großadmiral. Und ihr? Einstimmig: U-Boot-Fahrer, Herr Großadmiral.
National Socialism as a total dictatorship needed the cooperation of all parts of the population, the convinced cooperation. And therefore it was very important to indoctrinate the children in line with the regime, in order to subdue any resistance or criticism of the state. Because it was clear that the system was designed for expansion, that meant that you needed soldiers. You needed a population that was loyal to the regime and willing to carry the ideas of National Socialism out into the world.
In order to realize its dream of a 1,000-year Reich, the regime also needed a future leadership elite. They were to be trained in National Socialist fortresses.
Aus der herben Landschaft der Eifel heraus erstand die Ordensburg Vogelsang. Das gewaltige Mauerwerk der hochstrebenden Türme, die Bauten und Höfe und die monumentalen Plastiken sind Ausdruck eines starken, neuen Geistes.
There were only 3 of these Nazi cadres training centers in the Reich: Vogelsang in the Eifel, Sonthofen in the Allgäu, and Krössensee in Pomerania.
In practice, the students who went there and the curriculum that was taught there was, of course, centrally influenced by the National Socialist world of ideas, and that subjects such as racial studies and things like that were specifically added to the curriculum in order to finish high school. And military training, that is, the physicality of the education, played a central role.
Und also diese Körperlichkeit der Ausbildung eine zentrale Rolle spielt.
According to Robert Ley, head of the German Labor Front, who had created the schools, living tools of the Führer were to be created in these training centers.
Adolf Hitler-Schüler, die während des Krieges auf der Burg erzogen werden, wohnen dem Festakt bei. Der weitaus größte Teil der Ordensjunker steht heute an der Front. Dr. Ley übergibt dem neuen Burgkommandanten die Fahne der Burg.
After their training, many of the kids were among the regime's most fanatical supporters and participated in war crimes in the East. There, the situation for the Wehrmacht deteriorated steadily. After the battles of Stalingrad and Kursk, the Red Army launched another offensive on a broad section of the front. Between the Black Sea in the south and Vitebsk in the north, it took place in August of the same year. The increasing Soviet superiority made it difficult for German soldiers not to lose faith in the final victory.
It's actually holding on to hope. You ask yourself, how could they hold out for so long? Although it was actually clear after the Battle of Kursk and after these retreats that this couldn't be done militarily. One wonders, of course, how they were able to go on for so long, how they were able to motivate the soldiers to fight. And you shouldn't underestimate the hope factor. On the one hand, there was always the hope that the Führer was a genius, that the Führer was still going to do it, that the Führer was going to pull something out of the air, some miracle weapon, or that he still had some reserves.
In September, in the central and southern sections of the Eastern Front, the Wehrmacht had to withdraw further to the western bank of the Dnieper. The campaign continued to result in enormous losses. On an average day of war, 6 times as many German soldiers died in Russia as in the West.
Above all, it was the loss of personnel that was so painful. There was less and less infantry. As a result, victories were no longer possible. Take 1941. The great victories were largely won by the infantry, less by the tanks. And that was completely missing now. And the East Army was bleeding to death. They were only getting half as many replacements.
In early November, the Red Army liberated Kiev. Since the autumn of 1941, the city, like all of Ukraine, had been under German rule. The appointed Reich Kommissar Erich Koch wrote, "The goal of our work must be that the Ukrainians work for Germany. Ukraine has to supply what Germany lacks. This task must be carried out regardless of casualties." In Kiev alone, 150,000 prisoners of war and civilians were murdered. A Red Army dog squadron on its way to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The animals can detect explosives, injured or dead people, and were supposed to help secure the complex after the city was taken. Soviet propaganda units were also filming. Signs of the German occupiers. silent witnesses of the racist policies of domination. Cafes, stores, and theaters were forbidden to Ukrainians and Russians. The attitude of the Germans in the Reich Commissariat is determined by the view that we are dealing with a people who are inferior in every respect. Reich Commissar Koch had noted, by autumn of 1943, the madness about the master race in Kiev was over. A few weeks later, the Red Army achieved a prestigious victory in the northern section of the front. Leningrad had been under siege by the Wehrmacht since September of 1941. A deliberate decision was made not to take the city. Instead, Hitler ordered it to be cut off and then left to its own devices. At least 1 million people died during the blockade. The majority of the victims starved to death.
Leningrad was actually like a magnifying glass for the radicality and totality of this war, because on the one hand, for the Germans, cities had always been besieged. Since ancient times, there had always been famines in besieged cities. That's nothing new. But the new aspect was to not accept the surrender of a city at all. That was the plan. And also to raze the city to the ground. But it was the same thing on the Soviet side. No matter how many people died, the main thing was to hold Leningrad and to continue to produce weapons and do everything to supply the front line. The conditions were terrible. The party cadres took care of themselves, and it was the ordinary people who had to suffer massively here.
In January 1944, the Soviets launched an offensive to finally liberate Leningrad. The attackers met weakened defenders because Army Group North had to face a dramatic situation on other sections of the front and had to give up units. On January 27th, the former Russian capital was liberated. The 18th German Army under Colonel General Lindemann withdrew towards the Baltic states. In the Kremlin, it wasn't just stories of military successes by the Red Army that could be enjoyed in those months. By the autumn of 1943, the Soviets had achieved an important success on the propaganda front just outside Moscow. The focus was on a number of prominent German prisoners of war.
After the victory at Stalingrad, it was clear to the Soviets, especially after the victory at Kursk, that they would win the war. But the big question was, at what cost? The losses were still enormous. And then there arose the consideration, well, what else could we do to somehow end the war faster? Perhaps we can also supply pressure to the Allies, the Western Allies. So they will finally open a second front. Then they had the idea, we still have 22 generals captured in Stalingrad. That would be super if we could use them now to use their indignation at Hitler, their feeling of being betrayed, to threaten with a German opposition government, to threaten the Allies, to say, maybe we can come to an agreement with the Germans if we already have an opposition government which is even supported by the conservative military.
Walter von Seydlitz-Kurzbach became president of the BDO. The general of the artillery called for resistance against the Hitler dictatorship.
Fordert den sofortigen Rücktritt Hitlers und seiner Regierung. Kämpft Seite an Seite mit dem Volk, Hitler und sein Regime zu entfernen und Deutschland vor Chaos und Zusammenbruch zu bewahren. Wir würden unsere Pflicht als deutsche Männer verletzen, wenn wir dem für Deutschlands Unglück Schuldigen die Treue halten würden. Es lebe das freie, unabhängige und friedliche Deutschland.
Of course, that appeal was not seen in the German Reich. Here, the propaganda concentrated on its own success stories. A favorite topic remained the development of new weapons to help compensate for the increasing losses of men and material. Adolf Hitler attended a demonstration of the so-called Rail Wolf. The device was designed to render tracks unusable for the enemy, thus limiting their mobility.
Hitler had a soft spot for this sort of stuff. He was technically approachable and saw himself as an architect. He drew bunker plans and so on. And the great designers knew that, and of course, they also wanted to sell their weapons. So if you could get direct access to Hitler and convince him that you have designed a great weapon, you could then sell him your product bypassing the hierarchy, so to speak. And someone who understood this brilliantly was Werner von Braun.
Werner von Braun worked on the development of new types of rockets at the Army's Research Institute on Usedom. The focus of his research was the development of the liquid-fueled V-2 rocket. After the rocket's reliable flight capability was achieved, it was fitted with 1,000-kilogram explosive devices and renamed Vengeance Weapon 2. By the end of the war, over 3,000 of these V-2s were fired at England, Belgium, and France.
The V-2 was actually a technically very modern device that kicked off the development of the moon rocket. But it was actually wonderful for the Allies that the Germans built it, because it was so incredibly expensive and so incredibly complex. If the Germans had built conventional weapons, airplanes, tanks, could they have done much more things with those? And to what effect? A military effect? A few thousand civilians were killed by them in Antwerp, in London and other cities. But the military effect was, of course, almost zero.
Meanwhile, Nazi political celebrities never got tired of praising the wonder weapon, V-2. By the end of June 1943, Heinrich Himmler saw a demonstration of the rocket in Peenemünde. The test was a sobering experience. And so the SS Reichsführer quickly turned his attention to other topics. A few weeks later, he gave a particularly explosive speech at the town hall in Posen, which had been preserved as an audio document. It is one of the few sources in which a prominent Nazi politician spoke openly about the mass murder of the Jewish population of Europe.
Ich will auch ein ganz schweres Kapitel, will ich hier vor Ihnen in aller Offenheit nennen. Es soll zwischen uns ausgesprochen sein und trotzdem werden wir nicht in der Öffentlichkeit nie darüber reden. Ich meine die Judenevakuierung, die Ausrottung des jüdischen Volkes. Es gehört zu den Dingen, die man leicht ausspricht. Das jüdische Volk wird ausgerottet. Das sagt Ihnen jede Parteigenosse. Ganz klar steht in unserem Programm drin, Ausschaltung der Juden, Ausrottung machen wir, Kleinigkeit. Von euch werden die meisten wissen, was es heißt, wenn 100 Leichen beisammen liegen. Wenn 500 da liegen oder wenn 1000 da liegen. Und dies durchgehalten zu haben. Und dabei, abgesehen von menschlichen Ausnahmeschwächen, anständig geblieben zu sein, hat uns hart gemacht und ist ein niemals genanntes und niemals zu nennendes Ruhmesblatt.
In the meantime, railroad wagons full of people were rolling from all over Europe to the extermination camps in the east. As part of Operation Reinhardt, which had been launched some 15 months earlier, the National Socialists had, by the fall of 1943, murdered more than 2 million Jews and Roma. Any attempt to resist, such as the uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto in the spring of that year, was put down with extreme violence. The inhuman murder machinery of the National Socialists was in full swing. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, the World War raged on. After winning the Battle of Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, U.S. troops reached the Gilbert Islands in November. The archipelago was to be captured as part of the so-called Operation Galvanic. To accomplish this, more than 25,000 men of the U.S. Marine Corps were ready. The Gilberts were only an interim target for the American Navy.
They wanted to go from island to island, from the south to get closer to the Japanese mother islands. They wanted to get close enough to the Japanese mother islands so that they could use the Air Force against major Japanese cities and armament factories.
At 5 o'clock in the morning on November 20th, the attack on Tarawa, the main atoll of the Gilberts, started. The fighting troops were accompanied by war correspondents who produced impressive images of the fighting that later formed the basis for the propaganda film With the Marines at Tarawa. the landing GIs met stubborn resistance from the Japanese defenders.
It isn't easy knocking those Japs out of their positions. They're hidden in trees, behind revetments, buried pillboxes, bomb-proofs, bunkers. This bunker is giving us plenty of trouble. We have orders to clean it out. This is what we found on the other side.
Many of the Japanese soldiers would rather die than surrender to the enemy, and so every meter was fought for. Only after days of fighting did the Americans win the battle, but it was an expensive victory.
These are Marine dead. This is the price we have to pay for a war we didn't want. And before it's over, there'll be more dead on other battlefields.
Around 1,000 GIs were killed capturing the atoll, which is only a few square kilometers in size. Countless more bloody battles lay ahead for the U.S. troops before they defeated Hitler's fanatically fighting ally, Japan. Meanwhile, on the European continent, the Third Reich prepared for the Allied landing, which was expected sooner or later on the northern French coast. Troops and material were moved westward on a large scale. In addition, Hitler sent one of his most outstanding generals to the area. Erwin Rommel, who had achieved fame in North Africa as the Desert Fox, took up his command in France at the end of 1943 and reported directly to the Führer.
Rommel arrived in the West at the end of 1943 with orders to improve the defensive position there. And Rommel also succeeded carrying out a large construction program to really strengthen the so-called Atlantic Wall, with bunkers, buildings, with minefields, with the so-called Rommel asparagus logs, against airborne troops.
Zahlreiche Divisionen der deutschen Wehrmacht mit Hunderttausenden von kampferprobten Soldaten stehen an der westlichen Verteidigungsfront Europas bereit. Sie sind mit den modernsten Waffen ausgerüstet. Eine Infanteriekompanie kehrt von der Übung zurück. Scheinwerfer gegen nächtliche Landungsversuche. Generalfeldmarschall Rommel setzt die Besichtigung der Befestigungsanlagen fort.
Rommel was probably chosen because he was one of the most popular German army commanders who for a long time willingly placed himself in the services of Nazi propaganda. Here, the then 52-year-old let himself be filmed addressing his soldiers.
Auf den verfügten Geist unserer Truppe, auf die neue Bewaffnung und die Kampfmittel, die uns in die Hand gegeben sind, können wir den kommenden Ereignissen mit größter Ruhe entgegensehen und brauchen uns keine Sekunde den Kopf zerbrechen, gut oder schlecht geht. Es geht bestimmt gut.
Despite isolated progress in fortifying the installations, the unbridgeable Atlantic Wall remained a myth. Thousands of kilometers of coastline could not be protected efficiently. A few months after these photographs were taken, Allied troops would land in Normandy. The Atlantic Wall would not be able to prevent the success of Operation Overlord. Even Rommel couldn't do anything about that. On the day of the landing, he was on home leave. In southern Europe, the Allies were already on the continent by the fall of 1943. Anglo-American troops had been on the Italian mainland since September. Their goal, the conquest of Rome. The Wehrmacht, which had triggered the so-called Axis case and occupied the country after the loss of its Italian ally, withdrew to a defensive line about 100 kilometers south of the Italian capital. At this so-called Gustav line, the Allied advance initially came to a standstill.
The Wehrmacht lost the ability to attack in 43, and all counter-attacks during the Allied landings, such as at Salerno in September 43, failed. But what they could still do was defend. And defensive measures are actually tactically easier to conduct than offensive measures. That's why the Wehrmacht, even with their thinned-out units after all, there were heavy losses, still managed to behave tactically well on the defensive. And they had combat experience. They had been in this war for a long time. And so they managed to hold the front line here for a long time through this combination of factors, including the inexperience of the Allies and the inability of the Allies to adjust tactically to the German way of fighting.
Monte Cassino lies on the Gustav Line, a mountain with an ancient Benedictine abbey on top. From there, access to the valley of the Lieri River could be controlled, through which an advance all the way to Rome was easily possible. The Allies were therefore pushing for its capture.
Monte Cassino is very difficult terrain. It's not that very high, about 500 meters high, but it's a steep terrain, mountainous terrain. You can't operate there very much with tanks and the like. And the Germans were clinging to the mountains with everything they had, with very experienced troops who knew how to fight in mountainous terrain, even in the town of Cassino. They were very experienced troops whose division general used to be a tactics instructor and who knew how to wage war in this terrain.
In January 1944, the battle for the mountain began. Numerous cultural treasures were in the abbey and were also at risk. The German newsreel reported,
Diese unersetzlichen Werte vor dem Zugriff der britisch-amerikanischen Kunsträuber zu bewahren, wurden sie von der deutschen Wehrmacht in die Engelsburg in Rom überführt.
So far, the Wehrmacht had been more prominent in this war for the theft of cultural treasures than for their protection.
Ein Vertreter des Vatikans empfängt von einem deutschen Offizier das Verzeichnis der aus dem Kloster geborgenen Stücke.
Historical books, paintings, writings, and building plans found temporary shelter in the former mausoleum of the Roman Emperor Hadrian.
Kostbare handgeschriebene Urkunden werden von deutschen Soldaten in die Engelsburg getragen.
In mid-February, the U.S. Air Force bombed Monte Cassino. The abbey on the mountain was largely destroyed, and at least 250 civilians were killed. As a result, the ruins provided the German units with ideal conditions for defense. A bloody battle broke out that lasted for months.
In this battle, thousands upon thousands of soldiers on both sides died. But both military leaders were, of course, willing to pay that price. Because what would have been the alternative? The Allies would have had to say, okay, we'll agree to a draw. I don't think that would have happened. You had to win the war. And if you then lose a few thousands of people, then that's the way it is. And for the Germans, after all, there was no alternative. Because the question was, if they withdrew, where was a better defensive position?
It was not until mid-May that Allied units succeeded in taking Monte Cassino. More than 50,000 of their soldiers had previously been killed or wounded. The Wehrmacht estimated the losses on the German side at 20,000 men. The road to Rome was clear. On the 4th of June 1944, GIs of the U.S. Fifth Army entered the Italian capital without a fight. Rome had previously been declared a free city, but the war in Italy was far from over. Fierce fighting followed in central and northern Italy that would last until the spring of 1945.